Okay, so if we just briefly sum up, why Eros? Why make this delineation? Well, yes, because it's part of our life already. It should become more and more really evident. There's Eros involved in our relationship with the path and with awakening to different degrees. As I said, Eros is involved in our relationship with the path and awakening and the notion of awakening, and therefore Eros needs to be investigated there because it's part of my path, because it's involved in my relationship with it. It's certainly part of imaginal practice. Eros is certainly part of imaginal practice. And as I said, Eros involves and leads to soulmaking and widening of the senses of sacredness beyond, as I said, just the isness of things, and even beyond the transcendence that's possible for us, for consciousness. Transcendence in oneness or the unfabricated. And opening up sacredness wider than a kind of universal sacredness. We talked about this on other retreats, and we'll go into this on this retreat. So there's a kind of universal sacredness, and there's particular sacredness, theophanies, that preserve particularities. There's also, I'm just recapping here. There's also the making the link between sexuality and sacredness. That sexuality and Eros are not just defilements, and we want a path that has more than nothing to say, or very little to say about sexuality and about romantic love. That recognizes more involved than certainly than procreation, and also than metta. Before I venture a first definition of delineation of Eros, I want to say something, a few things, 3 or 4 things generally about this definition, but also about making definitions and delineations in general. So firstly is, and it's implicit in what I've been saying, I think, already, but people use the word Eros, if they use it at all in psychological or other contexts, in many different ways. And over the millennia, in fact, it's been used in to mean many different things. So there's a range in how people use it. So it's important to be aware of that. We are certainly not saying we have the right definition, everyone else is wrong. That would be utterly ridiculous. It's really not about right or wrong. It's more, for me, about what does this way of defining Eros, what does it lead to? So different ways of defining Eros unfold in different directions, if you like. And the way we're defining Eros sits within a certain conceptual framework of other things that I've mentioned, and a whole set of teachings. So what does that whole set move towards, and how does this notion of Eros, how is it supported by that other set, and how does it support that other whole conceptual framework? So really not about right or wrong or arguing with what people, but it's important. This is just one among many possible ways. The way where I'm going to define it in a minute is one among many possible ways. The way we're going to define it over this retreat actually is one among many possible ways. But it's also a delineation that's based on, if you like, a phenomenological approach, meaning just the observation of experience and what's actually happening in experience. But that observation is already informed and based on certain directions in practice to do with understandings of emptiness and also imaginal practice and notions of soul-making. So phenomenological observation is always informed by a conceptual framework, and it adds that. But the definitions we're using are based on really what is observed in experience in that territory. So not about right or wrong, that's the first thing, but what's it serving, and how can we define it in a way that serves our purposes. Second thing is a more general thing about definitions and delineations in general, and has to do with something that philosophers call the hermeneutic circle. Okay, hermeneutics is a word that basically means interpretation. It comes out of emerged as a word in terms of the study of sacred texts and scriptures, and what does it actually mean, this text? How should we interpret when the Buddha said this, or in some tantric text it says that, or in actually the Bible or whatever. So it has to do with parts and wholes in a way. So if I'm looking at a text, or if I have this concept of Eros, it's one part within a much larger whole. So this word that I want to interpret in the text, or the text itself, is part of the word is part of a much larger group of words that make up the text, and the text itself is part of a much larger, probably group of texts, or stream of tradition, or historical context, or whatever. And I can't fully understand the part unless I understand the whole. So I can't, in this case, we can't actually take Eros on its own and sort of understand that without understanding the other parts of a bigger whole of what we're calling this integrated vision of practice, integrated conceptual framework or architecture of practice that involves imaginal practice or soul making. I can't really take it on its own, Eros, separate from those, and hope to understand it. But similarly, the conundrum of the hermeneutic circle is I can't understand the whole until I understand the particular parts. So I certainly won't understand the whole text unless I understand the individual words within it, and I won't even understand this text unless I see and have a bigger understanding of tradition and the group of texts that it involves. So this applies actually to everything. It even applies to our understanding of mindfulness. Mindfulness, to understand, or you could say to move closer, if you like, to an understanding of what the Buddha meant, we actually need to understand the whole of the path and the whole of his Dharma, because mindfulness is situated within that Dharma, and its meaning and its directions and what it draws on and the assumptions and the all of that is has a place, as again a context. So I can't really understand mindfulness until I've understood the whole of the Dharma, if you like, and what the Buddha shaped with that and opened with that. And similarly, I can't really understand the whole of the Dharma unless I understand the individual elements of it. But it's the same here in relation to Eros. Eros is, as I said, tied in with a whole other web of concepts, and to take it out on its own and try and define it is actually not really, strictly speaking, possible. It's still helpful, and that's what I'm going to do as a start, but it's tied in with other notions, ideas, concepts, and experiences. Everything that I say so far, all these words that I've just sometimes thrown out without fully explaining, it will all get elaborated over the retreat, so that because of this problem with the hermeneutic circle, what's called the hermeneutic circle, because of this contextualization and relationship and the place something like Eros takes within a larger set and framework of ideas and experiences, etc. It means that we're going to have to move back and forth between a sort of small vision, big vision, and tie things together. So really, we're going to elaborate what Eros means over quite a long time and ask for your patience with that. But it's kind of necessary, and that will give us a much richer, deeper, fuller understanding that's actually much more helpful. The third thing about definition in relation to Eros specifically is that Eros classically is a god, a divinity. And divinities are by their nature not fully fathomable, not fully capturable in concept. They have some kind of infinitude to them, and so they're not fully definable. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't venture certain concepts, and I'll explain this much more later, why A, we can't avoid conceptuality, and B, actually conceptuality is part, is necessary and part of the erotic movement. And expanding, this is the thing, expanding, not a limited or fixed or stuck conceptuality. So that's where the rub comes. It's not that we just say, oh, it's divine, it's infinite, it's undefined, and we just shrug and forget about it. Then we don't amplify that. It doesn't come alive to us as an area of interest. But we can use concepts. We don't hope to ever completely capture it and say, that's it, that's my definition, watertight, it's very neat, thank you very much. Maybe in some traditions, actually, Eros is a semi-divinity, so he's sort of, what's the word, demigod, in between the divine and the not divine, if you like, and that may also allow us to be part of the reason why we can be more conceptual, or at least approach part of it, or begin to approach it through some conception. So we'll return to all this business about conceptuality. But let's start, having said all that about caveats and qualifications and all that, and complications about definitions, and let's start with a really simple definition, okay? A relatively simple definition. This is just a start, just to get us started, bearing in mind that we can't capture it completely, bearing in mind that it involves all other concepts, lots of other concepts, etc., etc., and that's not right or wrong, all that. Let's start with a really relatively simple definition. And I say Eros is a desire. It's a kind of desire. It's a wanting, but wanting what? It wants, let's say, more contact. It wants more contact, more connection with what we could call its object, or whatever erotic object we're talking about. We're going to use that language a lot. Erotic object means what's Eros in relationship to, or the beloved, if you like, if you want more poetic language. So Eros wants more, let's say, contact and connection with the erotic object. Now, because these words contact and especially connection have become so sort of used, they've almost lost their power. So I'm going to elaborate this a little bit. It wants more contact, connection. It wants to touch the erotic object more. And these words I'm using really quite broadly. What does it mean to touch? Does touch just mean the skin touching something? Certainly it means that, but it means much more. What does it mean to touch? Think of the fullness of that word, and how we can touch things, with what dimensions of our being and our psyche can touch things. It wants to touch more of the erotic object. It wants to know more. It wants to know the object more. It wants to know the beloved more. And again, that word know, think of the fullness of what that word means. I want to know you. I want to... I'm really using the words quite broadly here. It wants to experience more of the beloved, more of the erotic object. So it has to do with experience, intimacy. Eros is a wanting to penetrate the erotic object more, to open more to the beloved, to open to more of the erotic object, to penetrate more of the erotic object, and to penetrate more. So these words, and penetrate, open, maybe know, these are also words with sexual connotations, right? And that's deliberate. So it's not limited to that. But we're going to come back to these words in particular. But using these words broadly, Eros is the wanting of more contact, more connection, more touch, more knowing, more experience of, to experience more of, to have more intimacy, more penetration, and more opening to the erotic object or beloved. Now that erotic object could be anything, outer, so-called outer or inner, anything. The erotic object can be, and the object of Eros can be anything. And notice also about this simple definition for now, notice that word more. I put a lot of emphasis on that word more. I don't know the myth from the classical myth, but Eros always goes along with, I think there's another god called Pothos, P-O-T-H-O-S, is another Greek word. And Pothos is the infinite desire, or the desire for the infinite. So it's the more. This is the more. Pothos has something that it always wants to move on to, when it's got something, it wants more. So I'm going to say that pothos is a part of Eros. When we talk about Eros, it implies and involves and has as an intrinsic element pothos, and that's the more. It wants more touching, more knowing of, more experience of, more penetration, more opening to. Okay? So, you might be like, oof, that's not a very interesting definition. It's quite a humble definition in a way, and it's really starting quite simple, and in some senses it's quite a broad definition. Others it's quite narrow, and you might think, well, that's a bit of a disappointing definition, or maybe not a big deal. But my contention, what I hope you'll at some point be convinced by, is actually the beauty of this way of defining it, and that you will begin to see slowly, hopefully more and more, the power of it as a way of thinking about Eros, that it has all kinds of implications and consequences that emerge from it, that are kind of wrapped up, not so obviously, but are intrinsic to it, and create, if you like, the beauty and the fullness, the richness, and the multi-directionality of what Eros actually is and what it does. Okay, so again, notice again, Eros is not, we're not defining it as, or rather we're saying it's not the same as sexuality or sexual attraction or sexual energy. It includes that in our definition. That's certainly part of it, and you can, it's wanting more touch, more penetration, more openness, more to know, to be intimate. So that's sexuality is one one dimension of that, or one manifestation of that at a certain level in a certain direction. We're not also equating it with Freud's pleasure principle, the seeking of pleasure and pleasant sensations. Which would be one of, akin to one of the Buddha's lists of what craving or clinging involves. So that's certainly involved. Pleasure is involved, and I'm going to come back to this in Eros. But that's not actually what Eros is after. Nor are we, as I said, equating it with the what Freud would call the life instinct versus the death instinct, or even the life force. In other words, just the sort of life energy, nor love. So the way we're using the word Eros we're not equating them with all of these. There is a relationship of the way that we're using the word eros with each of those, but they're not equal. So in some instances, eros is the bigger concept, for instance, in relation to sexuality. In other times, other instances of these other definitions, eros would be the smaller concept. So I would say eros is a part or an element of life force, or better, a certain direction or manifestation of life force. So we, as beings, we have a certain amount of life force at any time, or just in our existence, and eros would be one directionality and one manifestation of the way that life force manifests. Eros, as I said, is one kind of desire. Craving would be another kind of desire. Craving for sense pleasures would be another kind of desire. But also notice something else. So in some traditions, and ancient traditions, and it's continued to this very day. So I think it came either from the Platonic teachings, I don't know enough about it, or from the Neoplatonic tradition. So for instance, there was a mystic and a sage and a philosopher with the wonderful name of Dionysius the Areopagite. Actually, he had the guy that I'm talking about had the even more wonderful name of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, because Areopagite. Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, because it seems for very complex reasons he was pretending to be the other guy, Dionysius the Areopagite, who had lived a few hundred years before that. Anyway, this Dionysius the Areopagite, among other teachers, defines eros as really that force that moves towards unification, towards union, towards melting in oneness, etc. So we are not defining it that way. This is important, and this is quite common in some psychologies and some spiritual teachings. He says we're not defined. There's a relationship between this movement towards unification, but actually it's actually more complex. So go back to our definition. Eros is this desire, this wanting for more contact, more connection, more touching, more knowing, more experiencing, more intimacy, more penetrating and opening to the beloved or the erotic object. So there's a relationship with the movement towards unifying. But, and we're gonna elaborate this, both of us will elaborate this a lot more, eros will always want more. It will always want more, which means that more of this connecting, touching, etc., opening to, which means that either it will, if you like, resurrect a two-ness, it will resurrect the beloved object after an experience of oneness or union, or it creates or discovers more of the other othernesses, other things to reach towards in the object. It complexifies this. We're going to explain this much more. Or it simply does not go towards union. It does not dissolve, move towards dissolution, towards union, towards melting, towards a collapsing of the two-ness into oneness. So either it does, but then it will re-instigate, actually create or discover, this is something we'll come back to, create or discover othernesses, or recreate a kind of more of the beloved other, so to speak, to move towards. Or it will simply not, it will resist somehow that collapse to oneness. It will preserve the two-ness, the self, if you like, and the erotic other, the erotic object, the beloved. Much more about that later, but this is a really, really important point. So, how do we recognize eros? How do we recognize the presence of eros in our experience, in our life, in our meditations, in our relationships? I remember teaching many years ago, well, quite a few years ago, and giving some instructions on mind states and emphasizing the awareness of developing sensitivity to how the mind state was sort of reflected in and affected the body and the experiences in the body, and also just the general texture of the mind space. And my two co-teachers commented afterwards and said that they thought some people just would never be able to do that, or couldn't do that, and a much better way of going about it was to say that you recognize the mind state through the thoughts. The thoughts, the kind of thoughts you have, tell you what mind state you're in. So if you have angry thoughts, you know that you're angry, etc. All I can say for now, and actually for the way that I would conceive of this whole set of teachings and the Dharma in general, is that we need practitioners, we need to develop our sensitivity and the subtlety of our awareness to be able to notice mind states, if we're calling Eros a mind state or a state of being, to develop the sensitivity to that without relying on the clues and cues of thoughts. From that, seeing how the energy body is affected, developing the sensitivity to that, to the textures of mind and the space of what we might call the space of mind, the subtle mental movements that are there even when there is no thought, or they're underneath or alongside thought. So I, in a way, stand by that in the sense that I can't really see how the kinds of things we're talking about and the capacity to work with them in practice would even be remotely possible without the sensitivity, those kinds of sensitivities. We're talking about developing practice in a way that demands quite a lot, and one of the basic things it demands is a sensitivity to the energy body and a more subtle sensitivity in general to the mind. But this ties into a point anyway that I said before and repeat again. When we talk about Eros, like everything, we're talking about a spectrum. So it can be incredibly intense and in a way quite gross and obvious, or really, really quite subtle. And somehow we want, if we're going to explore it and investigate it and include it as part of our reach of what the Dharma means and our practice means and our path means, then we're going to have to be sensitive and recognize its presence and be able to work with it across that whole realm of subtlety and intensity. That means that we can handle and work with and not get bowled over with really intense Eros, and we'll come back to that whole question about balance, etc. And also that we can recognize and work with it when it's really very subtle, and then that's still recognizable, sensible, and fruitful. So, also you'll notice, kind of implicit in the definition and part of recognizing Eros is that Eros involves attraction. There is attraction in Eros. It wants more X, Y, Z, as we said. So attraction is implicitly part of the force of attraction that one can recognize in oneself and feel and actually explore. Is attracted to what, as I said. But included in that, or because of that, or with that attraction, Eros has this felt tension in it. So Eros usually involves some degree of tension, often because of the more. You see, because of the more, it always wants more, or because, and as well, because, as I mentioned, the attraction towards the erotic object is not dissolved. Or if it's dissolved, it's only temporarily dissolved in union. There's an element in Eros, if you like, that preserves the otherness and therefore the tension of the two and the tension of the attraction. The attraction doesn't lead to oneness as a final resting, certainly either at all, or as a final resting place in which that oneness there's no more tension of the desire. So always, to say it again, there's the preservation of otherness or the creation of more otherness, so to speak, more of this object, more dimensions of this object, and therefore more otherness, or the discovery, if you like, of more to the object and more otherness, more to move into with this attraction, with the directionality of the desire. So you can already see it's simple, but it's already quite complex. And we're going to go into this thing about two-ness and oneness and preserving otherness and all that. We're going to go into that more, as I said. But recognizing Eros, again, Eros often has a certain, what we might call juiciness to it. Now that's quite interesting too. Juice, the word libido, which some people use interchangeably with Eros, the word libido is related to the word lips, and the moisture of lips, the drippings of pleasure. I'm taking this etymology from both from James Hillman and also from Onions, who wrote a book about the history of Western thought and certain concepts and traces them through history. The libido is related to the meaning is drippings of pleasure, juices. Libation, our word libation, drink, the excitations of lust, the pouring of liquid, as in libation, as I said, to deliquare is to make liquid, to make something a liquid, or to melt. The word, it's also related to the Latin word litus, which is moistness or fatness or fruitfulness. That's very key to our definition of Eros, is fruitfulness and gladness. And also related to the German Lieben, which is love, as well as to the word liber in Latin, which means free. And the god Liber was a fertility god, a procreative figure. It's also related to something you may have heard me say in other talks about the necessity to make all things liquid. Alchemical maxim, don't proceed until all things have been made liquid. In other words, not reified. So Eros, and in its connection with the word libido, is all this is wrapped up. Actually, we will be using the word libido, when we even use it, as meaning more something like psychic energy in general, the energy of the psyche. But anyway, it's related. And juiciness seems to be a part of the erotic experience, a part of the experience of Eros. Part of the reason for juiciness is that, and this is something we're going to have to explain in more detail later, is that Eros always invokes, stimulates, or involves or is involved with the imaginal and soul-making. Eros always invokes, is involved with or involves and stimulates the imaginal and the soul-making. I'll explain more about this later. And that process of soul-making and the imaginal is in itself rich. And so Eros brings more richness. This whole process of soul-making is a rich process and a juicy process. So, attraction, tension, juiciness, the imaginal, I'll come back to that, or image is part of Eros, or involved with Eros, that's part of how we recognize it. All this implies a kind of dynamism. So there's the dynamism of the attraction towards the object. That's also recognizable as a feature of Eros. There's this dynamism of attraction towards the erotic beloved. But there's also the dynamism of what I just referred to, and I'll elaborate much more as the retreat goes on, this dynamism of the stimulation of the soul-making process, which is a dynamic process. It involves movement, expansion, complication, enrichment, widening, deepening of image, of what we might call psyche, and also of conceptuality. So there's a dynamism involved in Eros that has to do with that dynamic. It's not always obvious at first. It's the dynamism of the attraction to the object that's more obvious. But actually what it turns out is the object that we're attracted to is more the complex of image, idea, Eros itself. that becomes the object. Much more about this later. But there's, as I said, if we're talking about recognizing Eros, so there's attraction, juiciness, tension, dynamism, arousal. Arousal is also a part of the erotic experience. Now, we don't necessarily mean sexual arousal, although of course that's a part of it, can be, or even perhaps even measurable or observable psychophysical arousal that a person might measure with electrodes or something or other. May or may not, I don't know. But really, it's the arousal involved with Eros is an arousal of interest. So we talk about the spark as well. There's an arousal of Eros, of interest. We're really interested in this beloved, where something engages us, compelling in the best sense of the word. It's really captivating, again, in the best sense of the word. The arousal is the interest is aroused, and also the energy body is aroused, by which I mean the energy body is energized. It will feel energized, it will feel open, and it will probably feel aligned. And I've talked about this in past retreats when we talked about the energy body working in imaginal practice. But it's also a feature of when there is Eros, the energy body is also aroused. Now that arousal, again, can be very intense, very, very intense, or really quite subtle, and it may be relatively unagitated. There's quite a peaceful feeling with it, often. Not always, but often. There's also an aspect which I think I will leave this to later when we explain more what I mean by the soul-making dynamic, Eros, Psyche, Logos, but I'll just mention it now, of autoeroticism. So that what becomes for us an erotic object also involves ourselves and involves our Eros. So the Eros itself becomes erotically beautiful to us, our own Eros, and ourselves also. I'll come. There's one calling autoeroticism. I'll come back to that hopefully in the next talk. Now let's invent another slight delineation here in relation to some of what we just said. I'm going to make up a delineation between two words, delight and bliss. And again, no at all claim that this to be a correct dictionary definition or the right definition or anything like that. But let's use the term delight and say that Eros usually is accompanied by or involves delight. Delight is involved with the erotic experience, by which I mean, by delight I mean a sense of fullness, of richness, of aliveness, of interest, as we just said. The delight of soul-making, of this enriching process, this expanding process that soul-making is. We can say, axiomatically, the soul loves soul-making. It's almost a circular definition of the soul. What's the soul? The soul is what loves soul-making. It loves this, what I'll explain more, this dynamic, this process of soul-making, of Eros, Psyche, Logos, in their mutual fertilization, expansion, deepening, enriching, widening. So that soul-making, I wonder, is intrinsically delightful, if you like. And Eros, because it goes with all that, it's almost always got a sense of delight with it. So you could say that's part of juiciness, but let's just say that's specific to the soul-making quality. Now, Eros may involve bliss, and again I'm just making up a definition here just for our purposes, and defining bliss as an experience of the energy body, of great pleasantness in the energy body, of rapture or joy in the energy body, and that kind of openness, etc. And sometimes, again, very intense, sometimes much more subtle. But that energy body experience of bliss, I would say, accompanies any lightening or unfabricating to whatever degree of the self sense, up to a certain point at least. When you get really deep unfabricating, I'm not sure you can really use the word bliss at all. And you get into the deeper jhanas, etc. But so that you can have a bliss without eros, or without delight, or without soul-making. For example, and I'll come back to this too, the bliss of first jhana or the third jhana may or may not be soul-making. In itself, in some ways, it's not, for reasons I'll explain. It's just bliss without eros and without soul-making delight, the delight of soul-making. But, and of course, sometimes you can have a delight in soul-making without bliss, quite often, so without that sort of strong feeling in the energy body. But basically, eros usually involves delight or is accompanied by delight, and it may involve bliss. Okay, so after recognizing eros, again, just run through those. Big spectrum and intensity and subtlety, involves attraction, that's implicit in it. It includes some kind of felt tension, juiciness, certainly, a richness of experience, dynamism of different kinds, arousal of interest of the energy body, autoeroticism, which I'll come back to. Delight usually accompanies it, and it may involve bliss, this pleasantness in rapturous or joyful, peaceful, beautiful feelings in the energy body, in the experience of the energy body. So these are some of the. This is a start to define eros in a very simple way with some caveats, and actually we're going to see what that does and expand and enrich the very definition or the delineation of eros and really fill it out over the retreat. Put it in relationship to other concepts, but these are some of the elements of recognizing the experience. So you already see, excuse me, in some of what we're talking about, it's hard to go too far in this without bringing in other as an element or part of this web or this architecture of ideas and experiences and delineations that we're going to try to unfold as part of this more wider, integrated, more far-reaching conceptual framework or path. And so that's what we're going to begin to do, start to draw it together and draw in some of these ideas and involve them in each other. Okay?
Thank you for listening. To learn how you